This video was brought to you guys by my great supporters from Patreon and Ko-Fi. Every supporter I get helps this channel going and allows me to support my editors. Please consider supporting the channel. Alright, enough shilling, let's get to the video. Back in the early days of gaming, around the 90s, there was an odd fascination with every gaming company wanting to create the next big video game mascot. Nintendo had Mario, Sega had Sonic, and the glory that was Sega to Sanshiro. I mean, that's one way to get people to play your games, kick their asses. And it wasn't just for major gaming companies either. You had characters like Rayman, Gex, or the abomination that was Bubsy the Bobcat. It's understandable considering that whenever you made a game back in the day, more than likely the character that you would play would already be an appealing mascot character. Obviously, some did better than others, fuck you Bubsy, but it was a great time of gaming where the creative designs of the characters would be enough to tell you what kind of game you'd be getting, as well as showing off some neat art in the process. Nintendo's been doing that for years. Mario, Metroid, Pokemon, Donkey Kong, you can pretty much see that sort of game style even being used today. But I want to go back to a time where games could be just fun to sit back and relax. And that's why we're looking at Klonoa. Klonoa was a very niche game series from the late 90s, produced by Namco, with developers Hideo Yoshizawa and Tsuyoshi Kobayashi, where you played as the titular Klonoa. Klonoa's gameplay, at least for the two main titles that we'll be talking about, are side-scrollers that had 3D elements to them. 2.5D to be precise. More prominent in the second game when we get to it in this video. This was during a time where almost every gaming company had a mascot or two, and in some ways, Namco still uses Klonoa in some way or another. One of my favorite examples of Klonoa is showing up as an alternate costume in Tales of Symphonia for one of the characters. Plus, he's got Pac-Man in his hat. As a game series is one of those comfort games. It's not really meant to be challenging, but more whimsical. Sure, there can be some challenge to the games if you really want to dive into it, but it's more of a relaxing experience, at least to me. Today we'll be talking about the two primary games, Klonoa Door to Phantomile and Lunatea's Veil. I'm MangaKamen, and let's go! Wahoo! Back in 1997, director Yoshizawa had a simple desire. He wanted to make an action game, one that would be playable for both adults and kids, and wanted to fill that gap between the ages. At the same time, this was the wild west of 3D, where there would be several PlayStation games that had 3D fields that would allow players to roam. Yoshizawa commented in an interview that he thought that some 3D worlds were confusing at the time, since there would be times where players wouldn't be able to know what to do or where to go. So the Klonoa team decided to have a 2D based game, but have 3D backgrounds, as well as playing with the camera, but we'll get to that shortly. Klonoa Door to Phantomile was released initially in Japan in 1997, but got an international release in the following year. If the name didn't give it away, we play as the character Klonoa, an odd-looking critter who has the elements of a rabbit and cat hybrid, along with wearing pants and a hat, living in the dream world of Phantomile. When the game starts, we're introduced to a cinematic cutscene of Klonoa coming across a ring in the forest. Once the little guy gets it, he meets a little spirit called Hupo who can enter his ring and give Klonoa a special ability, the Wind Bullet. I gotta say, this kind of thing has a certain charm from it. Sure, the graphics have aged quite a bit, but there's just something about these old openings that, while rough, still manage to show quite a fair bit of expression on the characters. Granted, I think Klonoa's ears have a mind of their own in some scenes, but it's still fun. When the cutscene is over, we're starting the game proper, with Klonoa leaving his home, Hupo entering his ring, and the two are off on their grand adventure. I'm going to state right now, I don't want to go too much in detail with the story, at least not yet, so we'll focus on the gameplay itself. Klonoa is probably one of the earliest 2.5D games, with 2D sprites juxtaposed against 3D backgrounds. They would twist and turn with the camera, and enemies would pop up from the background and jump onto your path. Hey, watch it, I'm gonna blow you up like a balloon.
Oh no.
Yeah, here's the thing about Klonoa. It's a simple game. You can run, you can jump, you can inflate enemies with a wind bullet, and you can throw your enemies. You can also float slightly in midair and when you jump. But really, this is all you do in Klonoa. It's a relatively simple game where aside from the D-pad, you only use 2 buttons to perform actions. Now, I know what you're thinking. Kamen, what's so great about this? Shouldn't games that are platformers be able to have wide kits? And to that I'll say, sure, but that depends on the game. Normally in platformers, especially nowadays, the key elements to their success lies in the player character's kit and level design. When you're moving about the stages, the levels need to be able to work with what your character is capable of doing. And if you have a limited mood set, you need to present new ways of doing the same thing. It's common in gaming. Hell, look at other 3D games around the time, like Super Mario 64. When you look at Mario's movements, he has a simple attack and jump. And the level design challenges you on what you can do with those, with limited changes to Mario under certain conditions with the hats. And I can say somewhat the same thing about Klonoa. It's because it also uses its level design to its advantage, because when you're carrying an inflated enemy, you can throw them in various directions. Left, right, into the camera, away from the camera, or throw the enemy so you can get a double jump. This stuff plays into the level design and works really well. Yes, the player is restricted to a 2D platform movement. The gameplay plays into that though by allowing the player to interact with the Z-axis. Or it should. Sometimes you come across items in the foreground or background and you want to interact with them, either your wind bullet or with an enemy that you inflated. It really goes into the layouts of the levels as well. It's not super challenging unless you unlock the harder stuff, but there's some creative ideas here, especially with the bosses. 2.5D elements for the game plays its greatest with the bosses, which oftentimes have these enclosed arenas where you're trapped with the boss and you have to dodge the obstacles and find a way to damage them. Each boss has their own feel to it and it has its own identity. Again though, the fault is the lack of challenge in the gameplay. There's a lot you can do with a half dimension here, and the gameplay isn't bad, but it isn't until the end of the game that you really get a good challenge. There's a lot you can do with this sort of gameplay, and while there are inklings of depth with Klonoa, it doesn't really reach that much height, at least not with this title. Now, I say this, but according to an interview with the developers of the game, when Klonoa was given as a demo at the World Hobby Fair, they had this to say. Right, we didn't want to design it to be a simplistic game for kids. We thought it as an action game a junior high schooler could enjoy. A large number of kids checked out the demo at the recent World Hobby Fair, and all or most of them could play it. They were a little unsure at first, but once they got the double jump down, it was easy. A lot of girls gathered around it too, and they were interested enough to try it out, which made me very happy to see. It was mostly younger kids at the fair. There were kids who made it to the boss and beat him, so everything seemed good. It was the adults who had a harder time, to be honest. There was a conscious effort to appeal to junior high school kids, and as such it was made with that in mind, although apparently there were some adults who had a hard time dealing with the bosses. Look, we live in a time where a grown man had a hard time getting past the Cuphead tutorial. I believe this to be the case with Klonoa too. I personally do not find the game to be challenging. We live in a time where gameplay isn't the be-all end-all for all games. And as much as that puzzles me to some degree to say, games are also used to tell stories and act as works of art. And I feel that the original Klonoa does so. That isn't to say that gameplay is bad, but it's more for fun than anything else. And while there is fun in games of challenge, that isn't a universal standard. But for me, Klonoa really stands out more with its presentation and story. I talked about the gameplay with a 2.5D style going on, but it really plays with the art style of the game. Again, the 2D character art along with the whole storybook theme that the game has around it really works. It has this whimsical feel to it, and you really feel like you're watching a story unfold right in front of you. The presentation is also helped by the music. One of the first songs that you ever hear in the game is the Windmill song, which instantly captures the upbeat nature of going out on an adventure. Or Jugpot Falls, which reflects a wonderful water-based stage. Or if we want to go for a more final stage feel, the closing encounter creates a pretty intense mood. The bass notes and the constant bams, and has a contrast of sparkling going on that adds a whimsical touch that reminds you that you are in the Moon Kingdom. There's a lot more music for the game that I could go into, but some of the best music is in the stuff that you can discover on your own with it. And it's nice to have that little surprise as well. Of course, there's the narrative, one I do not want to spoil since it's up to you guys to really dive into it, but I'll say the following. The villain of the story has a proper level of creepy and a proper threat to the heroes. The characters aren't annoying and are lovable, and not just in design, although Hupo's true form is kind of a thing of nightmares for me. Ugh.
Yo, put that bag back on!
And finally, the actual parts of the story really broke my heart in the first time I played the game, and it made me feel like what is real or not.
When you walk away, you don't hear me.
There's a lot to like about Klonoa during the Phantomile, but sadly, Klonoa wasn't all that big of a hit.
What the hell is this? For crying out loud, somebody throw a pie!
There were a lot of attempts to bring back Klonoa. Door to Phantomile had 2 remakes, one for the Wii in 2008 and later in 2022, Klonoa Fantasy Reverie series, which came out for multiple platforms and had the sequel in it as well. It was a celebration of the series' 25th anniversary. And there were a ton of games that were released in the Klonoa name. In 1999, Moonlit Museum was released. Only in Japan. Then there was the proper sequel, which we'll talk about in the next section, but then we had a beach volleyball game, which was only available in Japan and the EU. How do you get a volleyball game out of this? What? It wouldn't be until 2005 that another game was released for the Game Boy Advance, Dream Champ Tournament. And hey, America actually got this one. 3 years after the Japanese release of this game. Yeah, and there was one other game that came out in 2002 along with the Japanese release Dream Champ Tournament, and that was Densetsu no Star Medal, which was an RPG, and released only in Japan. Are you seeing a trend here, my friends? The problem with the Klonoa series, at least where I'm standing, is that Namco really didn't utilize the fluffy little guy right. Early in the video, but this was a time of Mascot characters in their games. A lot of the games that Klonoa had, though, sans the remakes, a good chunk of them never reached an American audience. Now, I'm not privy to the behind the scenes of Namco, but to me, the biggest issue that Klonoa had was that it wasn't actually promoted to a national audience. Characters like Crash, Spyro, Sonic, Mario, and the like were promoted heavily by their own creators. Namco, though, while they were Japanese commercials, and they displayed the game pretty well, there was a severe lack of advertisement. One that I remember is this one. Quite possibly the only thing weirder than your sister. Seriously, whoever came up with this advertisement, I hope you stepped on a Lego. Or this one too. Look, I like wacky video game commercials as much as the next guy, but these ones are just terrible. And the sequel game and the others, well, they just got bad if none advertising at all. Nowadays, putting a game out on social media is a lot easier. Hell, get the right people interested and you got yourself some free advertising. But back in the 90s, television was pretty much the only way to get really people interested. I'd even hazard to say that the game was probably on the wrong system. PlayStation, while a powerful console back in the day, was more or less known for its action games and RPGs. Meanwhile, Nintendo was more known for its platformers. And at least Nintendo would have probably cared a bit more about the advertising for the game. Hell, they cared enough when Klonoa's remake came out on the Wii to give it a commercial. Again though, this is speculation. I'm not the zeitgeist of what does and doesn't get to become popular. At least not yet. Maybe if I hit 200k subscribers this year. Granted, we've yet to talk about the proper sequel to Klonoa. This one. Oh, now this one was special to me. This was the one I grew up on. The one that I would always rent from video game stores. I would fight kids in the aisles just so I could get my hands on it because it was so fun and whimsical. And let me tell you, it's one of my favorite games of all time. Coming out in 2002, Klonoa Lunatea's Veil is a direct sequel to Door to Phantomile, and like before, it's a 2.5D side-scroller, only this time on the PS2! I get that a lot of people like to attribute that Sega Dreamcast is one of the best consoles of all time, but I gotta argue that the PS2 and its library were something else back in its time. Hell, you got things like Persona 3 and 4, the Sly Cooper series, Okami, Shadow of the Colossus, Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, and plenty more. What I'm saying is, the PS2 is probably one of the better old school consoles, and to call it that, I sound like an old man. I already have one foot in the grave already, and I'm at the face of life where I'm talking about things that were from my childhood. At least the conversations aren't that bad. I joke, but the PS2 was actually a bit of a godsend to Klonoa. Lunatea's Veil was set to be on the PS1, but with the powerhouse of the PS2 coming out, Kobayashi and his crew were able to get things like full polygon graphics, better camera work, and better presentation. And frankly speaking, I think they stuck the landing. Hell, one of the things I appreciate about Klonoa 2 is that stylistically it holds up pretty well to today's standards. Each of the characters have a unique design to them, to each their own charm. The main party has their own unique colors to them. Klonoa has more solid blue to him, Lolo has a good contrast of pink and warm colors, and Popka's got this yellow and orange to him. The designs really stand out. Speaking of designs, you notice that Klonoa's design is very different from his first one. He's taller, he's a bit more mature looking, and of course, he's got a lot more blue to him. Kobayashi said the following: "One of the complaints we received over the last game was that we over-ornated Klonoa. When you look at his silhouette, it looked confusing because his design was too busy. So we wanted to streamline his design and create a character whose unique features made you say, ah yeah, that's Klonoa right there." The fact that he looks a little bit more adult was also part of that. By making him a little taller, it made it easier to animate him as a polygon character. And I think it's a good way to consider character design, especially for a video game. Because while you do want there to be a cool design, you do want your character to be memorable and identifiable in your own game and against other characters. Even in darker areas, I always found Klonoa to be a standout character from backgrounds, and it helps with the stylization of the game. Not to mention, you can tell at some points the creators had a good time with Klonoa's facial expressions in the game. It's a small thing, but the fact that you can see a change of expression on the character goes a long way to really cement that Klonoa is an actual character and not just some pixels on a screen. I mean, for immersion's sake. I know Klonoa is not real. I'm not the crazy one. You're the crazy ones! You haven't subscribed to me yet! But it really all lends to making the character feel alive, and act more like a cartoon character than some pixels on the screen. And I think that really works well for a game like this, where the world itself has a lot of details to it, making it a character in of itself. And some of the concept art for the world is amazing, and that's reflected in the game's levels too. It works to make the world memorable, as each of the 4 kingdoms all have their unique vibe that correlates with the emotion that they represent. Alright, back up a second. The game takes place in a world called Lunatea, a dream world that is composed of 4 kingdoms, each that represents an emotion. Tranquility, Lalakushka, joy, jubilant, discord, Volk, indecision, Mira Mira. There is a 5th kingdom though, and that represents sorrow, but we'll get to that later. Each of the 4 kingdoms where the levels take place all have their own personalities. Take Joliant for example, where the entire kingdom is nothing but a giant theme park, so you see things like roller coasters, Ferris wheels, but has also things like a water slide where you're surfing on a board, and a haunted house that has its own unique music and scenery to it. Oh, old nightmare fuel just came back into my brain. Ain't gonna sleep tonight. In comparison, you've got Volk, which has its people blowing each other up. And Mira Mira, which is probably the best stage in all the PS2, where you're snowboarding and flying into a giant ice sculpture of a dragon, and then it gets all trippy with the stained glass inside it. Each of the kingdoms and levels really comes in their own and offers something fun about them in the design department, helped by the fact that the game loves to make use of its camera angles at various points in the levels, and we haven't actually gotten to the actual story and gameplay yet. Can you tell that I really love this game? Because I do. So let's actually talk about the story of the game. We begin with Klonoa falling through darkness, presumably after his last adventure in Phantomile. Yeah, I'm gonna have to explain something. You see, Klonoa is what the series likes to call a dream traveler. Essentially, he travels to different worlds in order to save them from danger. Phantomile was no different. Well, kinda. It turns out Hupo had erased all of Klonoa's memories before the journey began, just so Klonoa would think that he was a native of the world, and thus would be in the right mindset to save it. Not gonna lie, that's extremely messed up, dude. Even more so when you consider the fact that Klonoa had a quote-unquote grandfather who dies in the game. So did Hupo rewrite an old man's memories too before he died? Again, that is nightmare-inducing for me, as things involving memories being messed with really managed to hit me hard. Anyway, Klonoa's in a new world, Lunatea, where he gets saved by Lolo and Popka, with Lolo being a priestess of the world who can enter Klonoa's ring and help him use his wind bullet. The two happened to be nearby when Klonoa fell into the ocean, since Lolo was trying to ring a bell so she could pass the priestess test. Unfortunately, with Klonoa appearing, that kinda means that there's an issue in the world, so the three meet up with a local fortune teller, Bakuji, who warns the three of a 5th bell, a 5th nation, one that can put Lunatea into harm's way if it appears. So, being the stand-up guy he is, Klonoa agrees to help out, and with his 2 new allies, they go to visit the 5 kingdoms in order to reach each nation's bells, ring them, and collect their elements so they can stop the 5th bell from appearing. But they're not the only ones after the elements. No, we have the infamous sky pirate, Leorina, and her partner in crime, Tact. Now, I wouldn't say the premise for both games sounds interesting. How often do you hear that games have characters trying to find the magic MacGuffins? And it was something that even the first Final Fantasy did several decades ago. It's a tired trope, but it's a true one. Just because it has an element to it, that doesn't mean that the story is bad. Hell, the characters in and of themselves are very fun. Take Lolo for example. She's arguably the main character of the story, as she goes through a lot of the development throughout it and has a lot of story elements wrapped around her. Like with her coming to terms that she failed her priesthood examination numerous times, and the only reason why she succeeded this time was more due to Klonoa's power. I don't want to go too much in the story, but if you want an overarching theme of the game, it would have to be how to cope with sorrow. When people encounter sorrow, they try to forget it and pretend it never existed at all. Trust me, the story is more enjoyable to play through, and luckily there is a certain compilation on Steam and other platforms where you can play the remakes of the first and second game. So getting your hands on these titles aren't hard, but there are some issues. Really though, the Klonoa games can be a critical hit in the fields, especially for what is considered to be a kid's game, and sometimes you don't expect deep themes to be in such a colorful package, but it certainly works. What also works is the gameplay, which, yeah, that's a smooth segue into that section, Kamen. Much like the first game, Klonoa has a 2.5 gameplay mindset, and frankly speaking, his moveset really hasn't changed. He can run, he can jump, he can float in midair, he can inflate a baddie and toss them in various directions. Really, the challenge comes from the level design again. And I know what you're thinking. Well, Kamen, what does the game do differently from the first game in gameplay standards? Here's the thing. They offer a few new enemies that give you abilities. Take Keaton, for example. When you use your wind bullet, you get a lot more jumps so you can continuously jump into the air until he pops, and you can still use him as a weapon. Then there are the Boomies. These mouse-like creatures were in the original Klonoa as well, but I feel they're more utilized here in Lunatea's Veil, where you capture the little guys, they start to flicker, and then will explode eventually. I bring this up since they're more or less used for puzzle solving, and they won't explode on contact with things, so you could pick them up and throw them before they explode. Or Ilbrils. Where you double jump with them, Klonoa turns into a bolt of lightning that can destroy obstacles and attack enemies. I will admit there isn't a lot going on with that front. But it's nice that the team added some monsters that can change up Klonoa's kit if he uses them. But the biggest change is tied to the graphical upgrade. There are a lot more instances where you interact with the background and foreground that will be used. One notable example is Jolien's boss, where in order to actually damage him at some point, you need to aim to the foreground when he's rolling around in his tin can and hit him in his vulnerable spot. Or how about in one of the earlier levels where you gotta perform property damage with a pendulum to solve the issue? Wahoo! And we can't forget about the snowboarding segments. There are a few times where you do this in the game, and while the game is on rails, it doesn't change Klonoa's kit. There are times where the camera is played with and it doesn't really mess with the gameplay. I'm kind of reminded of the first level in Sonic Adventure 2 with this. You know, the part where Sonic is running away from the truck, and how the camera is looking directly Sonic in the eye and it's next impossible to see the rings coming if you don't know where they're coming from because I can't see them. Sure, it's cinematic as all hell and memorable. But it's something that irked me about that. With Klonoa though, it has the collectibles and enemies coming from behind, so you can actually plan accordingly. While not as flashy as Sonic's, I'm more for this because it's more in line with gameplay purposes. I suppose the last thing I can say about Klonoa 2 is the music. Dear lord, this music is so good that when I found a vinyl of the soundtrack, I just had to pick it up. Obviously you got one of the most iconic songs in the entire series, Stepping Wind. Works insanely well with the level it's in, and it makes it all magical. Even more so when it's actually sung by Klonoa himself. Look, I'm gonna go to bat that more and more songs in games, anime, TV show, what have you, they need to be sung by their voice actors. Kumiko Watanabe, the voice actress for Klonoa, did a great job with this one, especially when you consider this is sung in a made-up language for the Klonoa games. Of course, you also have one of the first songs going to Lunatea, which is a starting track to the game, and really puts you into an adventurous mood for it. Or if you want to go for a more atmospheric song, Maze of Memories is a retooled version of Moonlight Museum, a song that came from the game with the same name, but was retooled into a more mysterious atmosphere for the stage it's played in. Even the arena's theme, while simple, is a very effective tune played on a harpsichord, but since it played in a minor key, it makes it all the more spine-tingly chilly. It also gets retooled when we see the arena's more villainous moments, even adding a choir into the mix. So what I'm saying is, there's a ton to love about this game, and it's why I hunted down my own copy. You see, when I was a kid, streaming services and online play were only pipe dreams. You'd have to go and rent your games as a kid, so for $2 a weekend, I would go to my local rental store and pick up a copy of this game. I would then spend my weekends, after doing chores, playing this game. I would put so many hours of playing it, engrossed in its story, its world, its characters, its music. And while the gameplay was simple, it didn't matter. I was on an adventure. The game was about 23 years old. Hell, March 23rd is when it'll hit the 23rd anniversary of this game, at least going by the Japanese release date. And when the PS3 came and gone, and the era of PS4 came, and video game rental stores were starting to phase out, they were slowly selling their stock. I made goddamn sure that I was the first in line so I could grab this copy of Klonoa. This specific disc, I paid for it and I made it mine. I love this game so much that I wanted this piece of my childhood, this artifact, this little disc that had such an impact on my life. And I'm so glad I could talk about this game on my channel, but I have to be a realist. While this game did get a lot of good scores from critics, it didn't do so well financially. And why is that? Well... Obviously, there's a lot of love for the series of Klonoa. It's a niche series, but in recent time, there's been a bit of a push to have the little guy go Wahoo again. Even popular VTubers came and sang the most iconic song of the series. And there have been countless video essays about how the series and singing its praises, and this video is no different. Heck, there's also the release of the previously established Fantasy Reverie remake series, which had both the first and second games in it. So I have to ask, why is Klonoa stuck in the void? And there are plenty of people who have fallen in love with this game series, even to the point where one of them actually paid me to make this video you're watching right now. Thanks again for that. So, why? There's an obvious push to have Klonoa be big by people, but Namco just doesn't see it. The Fantasy Reverie series is the latest games after 13 years of silence for Klonoa, and it's a remake compilation of the two most well-known games. Hell, back in 2012, there was an attempt to revitalize Klonoa. The little guy even got a pretty good-looking official webcomic that got cancelled, which is sad because it had a good blend of characters and beats from all of Klonoa's games. I'm willing to bet most people who are watching this video are just familiar with the PlayStation console and have no idea who Gunsa even is. And unfortunately, this issue is one I can't really say I'm surprised about. I talked earlier about how the marketing was for Klonoa, especially in the West. It was nearly non-existent. Even when the game came out on Wii, there was only one commercial for it, and it really didn't push the game in the best way. At least Nintendo gave enough of a crap to actually make it a commercial and allow people to enjoy the game, even if the remake has its issues. And the same could be said for the recent remake as well. Don't get me wrong, it had a lot more push than the previous titles, especially in the wake of social media, and while the game came out to positive reviews and some fanfare, it really didn't help the series all that much. Sure, the series celebrated 25 years with that remake, but considering that a good chunk of those 25 years was a drought of games, can you really say it was a good anniversary? I say this not to spite Klonoa, but because I love the series with all my heart and I want to see the little guy come back in a proper adventure, one where the heart and soul of the series gleams out. But to have fun with a new and original story too. I love Klonoa as a game series. I just wish Namco loved it just as much as its fans do. And unfortunately, even its creators seem to love it as well, from what I've read on the interviews. But until then, we'll just have to hope and keep on dreaming. I'm MangaKamen. Thank you for watching. Have a good night and sweet dreams. I want to thank everyone who's been supporting me via Patreon, Ko-Fi, or channel memberships, which you can do right now, and you can get more videos like this. Thank you very much, everyone. Peace out.